So good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. So I'm going to give a talk on cloud computing, of course, with a particular focus on its applications to science. But I'm not going to talk about how you can run scientific workloads on the cloud, which of course many people are doing and with great success. I more want to talk about how we can use cloud capabilities to construct new sorts of services that can support various sorts of scientific applications. And I'll be talking in particular about our experience doing that, building the Globus system that we've been operating for the last, more than 10 years now. But hopefully they'll be broadly applicable. So science, first of all, point out is a highly distributed activity. It's not typically very centralized. And I'll start off with just a fun couple of examples to show how long it's been a distributed activity, and then talk about some more recent ones. So let's see if I can make this work. Yes, okay. So I'll start off by going back to 245 BC, where this a very smart Greek mathematician, Eratosthenes, succeeded in producing a tremendously, actually for the time, accurately estimate of the diameter of the Earth. And he did that by measuring the same thing in two different places. Presumably not quite at the same time, although maybe he had an assistant. But he measured the angle between a vertical stake and the shadow from the sun in one place, measured the same thing in yet another place some distance away, and then used a simple calculation to estimate the diameter of the Earth. So a distributed activity. Here's another one, a bit more contemporary. Admiral Fitzroy, some people may have heard of, sort of the father of the modern weather forecast. His innovation back then was to create a network of stations using the then new telegraph, as well as I think train systems, to take measurements of the atmospheric conditions, pressure, temperature, wind speed, etc., at different locations across the United Kingdom. And based on that, produced what he came to call weather forecasts. That was a term he came up with. He didn't want to say predictions because that would imply he was sure, but forecast he thought was an okay term. And of course, that also, as well as in bringing in the modern era of weather forecasting, it also started the tradition of people complaining about the forecast not being very good, because they were not. But based on that, he was also able to do some astonishing things like understand for the first time the global structure of weather, at least in the context of Europe, in Northern Europe, and understand that there were things like extratropical frontal cyclones and so forth. So here, as elsewhere, climate requires the coordination of data collected from many different places. So here's some more modern examples. I'll just go through them pretty quickly. We're engaged in a project called the Earth System Grid Federation, which is collecting, it's been going now for more than 10 years, collecting data from climate models at different locations around the world, more than 100 models, collecting the data from those models, bringing them together, and then comparing their results in order to obtain at least some sort of estimate of the uncertainty in our estimates of future climate change under different scenarios. This application involves petabytes of data worldwide being brought together for scientific research. And here's another even more contemporary example. This is a project led by a fellow called Arvind Ramanathan at Argonne National Lab and others, aiming to create a global observatory and surveillance system for pandemics such as COVID. And it's quite a fascinating application. If we had more time to go into it in detail, it would be, I think you'd find it amazing how it works. But the idea is to, first of all, collect genomic sequence data on many different COVID variants, as well as on other pathogens. Build a foundation model, a deep learning foundation model trained on these many different genetic sequences, and then use that foundation model to generate possible COVID, what do you call them, variants that may emerge, screen those variants with knowledge of the body's known ability to respond to COVID genes, and then based on that information, predict variants that may emerge in the future and be variants of concern, and then push that information out to field labs where people can search for them and hopefully be able to find them before they become significant. So again, a highly distributed problem. One more application that we're involved in at Argonne as well is urban observatories, which bring together, in this case, air quality data, forecasting data, satellite imagery, in order to help prepare for both short-term weather problems and long-term climate change. Okay, so all of these applications have this point in common, that they require the coordination of large amounts of many people, lots of data sources, computers that are distributed on a global scale. So in other words, it's a distributed, they all involve various forms of distributed computing problems. Now, distributed systems are very hard to build in a way that is reliable, efficient, secure, etc. And the community has spent many years working out how to address some of the problems that arise. And what are some of those problems? Well, first of all, we might say the networks that we're working in have a non-conventional geometry. The time to get from A to B may be less or more than the time to get from A to B and B to C, because of the different capabilities of networks that connect the various sources that we may be interested in. Now, connectivity is often intermittent due to failures of various sorts. It's hard to know whether things happen. Now, this is the tree falling in the forest. Did it fall? Well, did anyone see it fall? Were they able to communicate the fact that it fell to someone else? Determining when things happen can be a problem. Knowing, if we've got clocks, we can measure the time that things happened in two places, A and B, but how do we know how those two times relate to each other? And then one final point, getting people to agree on what happened. These are little kids holding these little, that used to make radios with a tin can and a string. So they're trying to talk to each other via a bunch of tin cans and strings. And we want to get them to agree on what happened. So these are traditional, well-known problems in distributed computing that date back to the very first days of computer networks. And they still are, to an extent, a significant problem, although I'm going to explain that we have new ways of overcoming them today. But just for fun, it's fun to look at some of the things that people have done to overcome these problems. This is something that I don't know if it still exists, but when I first heard of it 20 years ago, I thought it was wonderful. In places like, I think, Cambodia and rural India, the lack of reliable internet, in other words, these issues of intermittency and odd geometries led to solutions such as mobile systems that will carry around data stores plus wireless networks, pick up email in one location and drop it off in another location. Obviously, very high latency, but hopefully reasonable reliability. In terms of agreeing when things happen, the network time protocol was a tremendous innovation in its time. This is a method basically for estimating the time at a particular place based on what you know about the signal propagation time from other places and the time that is seen at those places. This is not so dissimilar to what Einstein was thinking about in the patent office in Zurich when he was a patent clerk and people were trying to do time synchronization over railway lines. But in this case, it's over the internet. And then agreeing what happens has spurred a huge amount of effort in consensus algorithms of various sorts, which allow a group of individuals who periodically receiving intermittent messages about other people's views of the state of some activity or system, are trying to decide what they should believe and when they should update their beliefs on those systems. And that's another very complicated area of research. So if we had to build all of these sorts of capabilities into our distributed science systems, we'd be in significant trouble. Things would be very complicated. However, things have changed a great deal in just the last decade or so. And I'll mention a few ways in which they've changed. Well, first of all, telecommunications have changed from being intermittent, expensive, not universally available to something that is, well, increasingly globally available. Of course, there are still areas where that's not quite true, but universal, quasi-universal Wi-Fi optical networks, low Earth, small satellites, free space optics, something that's not quite widely available, but I expect it will be 5G networks. They all mean that we can, most of the time, count on high quality communications, regardless of where we are. And then, of course, we have the cloud, which has changed things in fundamental ways because major cloud providers, the commercial ones, the big commercial ones, other ones, etc., increasingly operate services that make it easy for us to determine reliably, when something happens, what is happening, whether something happened, and so forth. For example, the bottom left here, or the bottom slide, I show a sketch of the architecture of a time synchronization and distribution system run on top of various cloud systems. So highly reliable, highly available, synced with atomic clocks in various places. NTP, Network Time Protocol, is still being used, but in a sense that the problem it originally set out to solve is partially being solved by these systems. And then in terms of being able to determine reliably whether something happened and what happened, can be outsourced to, handed off to some significant extent, to highly replicated, distributed, consensus-based systems in the cloud, so that, for example, if I have data that I have to know is going to be available to me, and I need to know exactly what its state is, it's often now more efficient, more reliable to load that into an Amazon or a Google distributed database than to try and maintain such a distributed database myself. So that's an exciting set of capabilities. So what we've been doing over the last 10, 15 years now is working out, well, given these capabilities, how might we go about changing what we do in terms of the science services that we provide to people? So the three things that we're interested in being able to do in a global science environment are as follows. We want to be able to act on resources. We want to be able to access data, move data from one place to another, perform computations, control robots, take measurements, etc. So we want to be able to do that regardless of where they are located. We want to be able to perform those actions reliably, ensuring at most once execution or exactly once execution, depending on context. And then very importantly, we need to be able to manage who's trusted to perform these operations, where they can, who can perform them, what they can perform, where they can perform, when they can perform them, and so forth. And in each case, there, of course, remain lots of challenges, even given these centralized global cloud services that I was talking about. So the approach that we take, and I'll sort of describe how we do it in the next few slides, is we might think of it, as using the old California slogan. We're going to act locally, but think globally. So the global thinking is the cloud services that we'll deploy. The act locally is the actions that are going to be performed in different places. And the result is what we might call a hybrid software as a service model. In this case, the cloud is at the bottom. So we use Amazon Web Services exclusively, but we know that the other services are also wonderful. But Amazon has stood us in good stead for quite a long time. But we run a set of services, highly available, many nines replicated over many Amazon availability zones that then manage activities between endpoints. Well, endpoints are basically things that can act locally. It could be an interface to a storage system, to a compute system, to a scientific instrument that are located around the world, actually in more than 100 countries at this point. By thus dividing up the task of managing activities in the bottom blue box from that of actually performing the activities, in this case, I'm showing a data transfer, we greatly simplify the implementation task of our distributed science systems, and we also increase their reliability in interesting ways. So under the covers, we use all sorts of services. I'm not going to say much beyond this slide about them, but people do say to us it would be nice if our systems ran on other clouds, but we find that we quickly got locked into the Amazon universe or platform. But the obvious things: we store state in simple storage service and various databases. We run servers that manage activities on EC2 instances. We use step functions and Lambda to trigger activities, and so on and so forth. We use the usual set of services that you might expect in ways that turn out to be effective and not especially expensive. So now let's see what we do with these things. So I already mentioned data transfer as an activity that we want to be able to perform. So all of the applications that I talked about at the beginning need the ability to move data reliably from one place to another, which sounds like a very more boring and mundane thing, and arguably it is, but it's something that we've taken as our mission to make run reliably, and we've been able to do it quite well. So this is the basic idea of what we call the Globus Transfer Service. It's a cloud-hosted service running on Amazon. It accepts a request to move a file from one location to another. That request could be one file, it could be 100 million files, it could be a byte or 10 petabytes. Under the cover on any storage system that we want to be able to access in this way, we have a little Globus Connect agent, and there's tens of thousands of those deployed around the world at this point in time. We do all the obvious things. We have nice simple interfaces for running and monitoring and managing these things. We use optimized protocols. When you're managing things from the cloud, you can observe and optimize in ways that are hard to do otherwise. We have retry-based protocols to deal with failures, and we interface many storage systems. At this point, we've transferred about 2.5 exabytes. That's going up pretty rapidly, and it's about 60,000 storage endpoints in more than 100 countries are being used. So a few things. This is a bit out of date. It says 39,000 active endpoints, but Globus Connect agents, interfaces to many different storage types. Won't say much more about those, except the last half meter is often the rate limiting step in data transfers, and so we take a great deal of care to optimize that carefully. Nothing to do with cloud, so maybe not of great interest here. But I did say a bit about optimization. That's a bit more interesting. So there are all sorts of interesting parameter choices, configuration options that determine how fast data can move from one parallel storage system to another. The degrees of concurrency in the file system and the network, the window size parameters, the various other parameter choices. We've learned that a cloud-hosted service, by observing what's going on, can do a very good job of optimizing those parameter choices, and therefore do a lot better than some simple tool that didn't take advantage of those optimizations. I don't think I'll go through here, but I've shown here, HPC to HPC, high performance computing to high performance computing, HPC to cloud, cloud to cloud. These are all cases that we spend time optimizing. Oh, wow. And if you go to our webpage, you can watch this little clicker go over, which is, I find fun. Can you see it down the bottom there? So it's going about 10 gigabytes per second at the moment. It's a lot faster since I made this slide. So I'll just say a few words about how at least high-performance computing centers, university research computing centers, integrate with these sorts of cloud services. And if you're not network people, you probably are not familiar with this concept, but there's a lot of engineering effort and research insights that have gone into architecting what's often called the science DMZ, or data transfer node architecture, which is designed to allow data to move very rapidly from high-speed storage in one location and somewhere on the globe to another location on the globe, without having to traverse firewalls, which traditionally have been a major source of delay in data transfers. And the idea is you have these so-called data transfer nodes that sit behind a border router. Routes can be defined from one to the other right through the network, bypassing any firewalls. And these are all managed by this cloud-hosted Globus service, which is how most people nowadays tend to move data at high speeds from one place to another. Okay, so the use of cloud services then can simplify the configuration of these high-speed transfers. It can, we'll say more about how it negotiates security issues that arise when you're performing transfers. But another concern that arises is dealing with failures. So, oops, wrong way. This is some data from a particular National Science Foundation project called Exceed over about a 10-year period, during which they ran millions of, more than 1 million transfers in total, and they observed that 1 in 17 encountered a transient fault. That's a transfer that failed. More than one in 180 encountered a checksum error. That's an error that would have gone undetected by the TCP checksum, and thus would have resulted in data corruption. So the use of this cloud-hosted service to monitor and manage and retry upon failure allowed all of these problems to be overcome. So here's one more example of what one can do with these sorts of services. So say you want to replicate the climate intercomparison data that I mentioned earlier, about 7 petabytes, from one place in California to 2 other places in Illinois and Tennessee. So it's about 15 petabytes need to be moved overall. Of course, failures will occur and so forth. But we performed that over, I think, about 2.5 months using the Globus service. And this is showing what happened during that time. There were various configuration issues at the beginning. There were some file system configuration problems at the end. But ultimately, this proceeded without human interaction, apart from those reconfigurations during that 2.5-month period, despite many failures. This shows the frequency is numbers of faults that were seen during that time on different links in this transfer, and the number of faults seen per transfer down here. So most transfers saw just a few faults. A few saw a lot. There were times during that 2.5-month period when many faults were seen, and then other times in which not many were seen. But of course, they occurred routinely. Okay, so let me put up a summary slide here. This shows some statistics of this cloud-hosted service that we've created. So actually more than 500,000 registered users at this point, 60,000 endpoints in more than 80 countries, thousands of connected institutions. These are all nice things, of course, in terms of the scientists that benefit, but the reason for mentioning them is that to show that this notion of cloud-hosted, cloud-managed local actions is something that actually works. Here's one more slide that I find interesting to look at. It takes a bit of time to understand it. So this is the x-axis is the great circle distance from source to destination of a transfer. Every dot is a transfer between one site and another. The y-axis is the size of the transfer. It might be millions of files, but maybe they add up to a petabyte, in which case they'd be up here, 10 to the 15th. And the color is the transfer speed. And so you can see, obviously, that bigger transfers and shorter distance transfers tend to be faster. You also see that there's not many transfers that take about 5,000 kilometers, which, if you think about the shape of the world, there are very few major human-inhabited places that are 5,000 kilometers apart. The oceans get in the way. And there are some that go a very long way. This is the furthest point that we've seen is from Lugo, Spain to Lincoln, New Zealand. And if we look at an old childhood atlas, this is one that I had as a child in New Zealand, you'll see that New Zealand and Spain are on opposite sides of the world. So they're about 180 kilometers apart if you project through the globe from one side to the other. That's why English people often call New Zealand the Antipodes. It's the opposite side of the planet from that country. Okay, so that's a very high-level view of what we do with data transfers and how we use cloud-hosted services to optimize them. Now let's look at some other things that we may want to manage in a similar manner. So one thing we may want to be able to manage is sequences of operations. For example, taking data from a scientific instrument, moving it to a computer to extract information from it, publishing that information to a catalog, and then perhaps taking the published information and doing something else with it. So we also are now experimenting with and achieving success with a service that replaces the simple transfer service in the cloud with a flow orchestration service called Globus Flows, which then performs similar actions. It uses the same sort of ideas of interfaces to external actions, retry-based protocols, uses a simple declarative language for flow definitions and so forth. And it can then go ahead and do things like here, take data from be notified when data appears at a scientific instrument, use that notification to initiate a transfer, use the transfer to initiate a computation, and then use that completion of the computation to initiate a publication operation. And people are using this to do things like the following. So creating what I call smart instruments. So here's an example, a instrument at Stanford. The Stanford Linear Accelerator Center generates data at very high rates, too high to process for detecting interesting events using a conventional computing approach. So instead, we want to train a deep learning model to run on a local GPU. The problem is that training on the GPUs there takes too long to be able to respond usefully. It takes more than almost 20 minutes. So instead, what we are able to do is we transfer the data rapidly to a AI supercomputer, a Cerebras CS2 at Argonne. Takes 7 seconds to transfer the data, 19 seconds to train the model, 5 seconds to train the model back, for a total of 30 seconds. So we speed things up by a factor of 35, and are able to then do continual retraining while a model is operating. And that is all performed by one of these flows, sequences of operations that are hosted in the cloud, managed by Globus Cloud Services. And that this stuff is going well enough that now people are deploying these endpoints at many facilities. For example, this is the advanced photon source at Argonne, a high energy synchrotron light source. Essentially, every beamline has one of these transfer endpoints, and there are many different sorts of flows being created that will to implement different forms of data analyses, model training, data processing, data publication pipelines, and so forth. So I think I'll skip over that and that. Let me move on and say a few words about probably the most complicated aspect of these cloud-hosted workflows, which is identity and access management. So the key to our goal was to be able to hand off to third parties, in this case, the Globus service, the responsibility for performing some activity. And that activity could be, as we just showed, collecting data from a beamline, moving data to another institution to train a model, inspecting the model, returning the model to the original site for deployment and subsequent execution. And in the context in which we work, each of those resources that we're going to be using, and there are many of them, require potentially different credentials, have different authorization or authentication protocols, different authorization requirements, and so forth. And so one needs to be able to, what one wants to be able to do is to delegate or assign to the program that's running on your behalf, in this case, the Globus Flow, the right to perform all of those actions on your behalf, but in such a way that the entity that you're assigning them to can't do other actions, and also other people who aren't assigned those rights can't do those actions or any actions. And so you end up with this need for what we call fine-grained delegation, which is quite a complex and interesting computational problem. So the basic idea is that you want to be able to start off, the user assigns a credential. I think I might have a better example here. Yeah, the user gives consent to the flow to run a particular flow. The flow can then retrieve tokens to perform different activities. It can then pass those tokens to various cloud-hosted services that allow it to then retrieve additional dependent tokens and eventually perform actions on the nodes that it is authorized to run on, but not on others. So making that all work has been quite an interesting challenge, and we're at the point now where we have this going with actually thousands of identity providers running, billions of access tokens, and many people running things, and actually running with a high degree of reliability. So that's, I feel, a really exciting development that's arisen just in the last few years. I think I'll skip over this as well. So some of the things that people are doing with this. So now at this point, we've got a global fabric, cloud-hosted action providers, tens of thousands of locations that allow you to move access data, access instruments, and perform computations. So what can you do with these things? Well, some of the things that people are doing beyond the ones I've just mentioned, privacy preserving federated learning, where you want to be able to run learning algorithms at remote sites and then feed back the partially trained models to a central site or exchange them with other sites in order to increase the credibility of your predictions, but without exchanging information about the underlying distributions of the data that you're training on. You may want to be able to run large distributed computations over many sites. In this case, I show a use case involving drug screening protocols, but large-scale model learning is another one that people are increasingly considering as well. Of course, there's lots of smarts that go into making these algorithms work well, but having the underlying substrate that allows you to perform actions remotely, reliably, securely, efficiently, allows a lot of experiments that were previously perhaps not so feasible. But what else can we do with such a global computing fabric? So something I'm interested in at the moment, and I'd like to say a few words about, is we can, we're excited about modern AI developments as anyone, and we are exploring the use of AI methods for all sorts of things. But one thing that we can start to think about, given a global computing fabric such as I've just described, and advances in AI methods, we can start to think, well, can we train AI agents to act on resources in a distributed environment to do things that we couldn't do otherwise? And we might, seek to realize what we can call embodied agents. It's an old term, but basically it refers to computational systems that are able to interact with their environment and learn from those interactions. So here's an example of one such system or set of agents that people at Argonne are developing, and I'll use it to illustrate a few different things. So the challenge here is, or the goal is, to design antimicrobial peptides. So this is a peptide is a small sequence of amino acids. An antimicrobial peptide is one where that sequence interferes with the replication of a bacteria or a virus. A good antimicrobial peptide will target some bacteria, the bad bacteria or viruses or protozoa or whatever, but doesn't interfere with the functioning of human cells or other cells that you want to keep around. So it's quite a challenging problem to design such things. So my colleague at Argonne, Arvind Ramanathan, and quite a few of his colleagues are building up sets of agents that can do different things in order to design such things. So first of all, they might use a generative model to propose peptides based on what we know about peptides that have already been discovered and found useful. Then they can engage with online databases like PubMed and query foundation models like ChatGPT or others to ask for potential hypotheses about the functioning of peptides in particular contexts. Then they can interact with computational systems to seek to predict the structure of a particular peptide, and then perhaps to evaluate how it might interact with a particular bacterial structure based on what we know about it. At various points, it might go ahead and engage and run high-performance computing simulations to both predict structures and to examine interactions between peptides and other agencies, other entities. And then ultimately, it may go ahead and perform actual physical experiments in a biological wet lab. And based on these outputs, it might go back and ask for additional peptides to be evaluated in the same way. So this is arguably it's at this level, it just looks like a straightforward workflow. The two things about it that are interesting: one is that it's got these AI agents in the side the circles, which actually make it more powerful. It's got the ability to learn how to interact with the various sorts of resources that it's working with based on available knowledge and on experiences from running over time. And then it's also going to be interacting with resources at many different places: computers, data systems, databases, experimental facilities, and so forth. And that's why it needs this cloud-hosted global compute fabric in order to be able to do that. So what we've been doing recently is working out how we can push down so that instead of just accessing computers, we can also access scientific instruments. And that's sort of a fun problem. A scientific instrument is arguably just like a computer. It's got an API. You can instruct it to do things. You can observe how it reacts. But of course, the protocols and problems that arise can be a bit different. But here's some facilities we've set up at Argonne for this purpose. These are all autonomous research facilities. They can be controlled remotely via APIs. They have different properties. Some are for biological experiments, some are for material science experiments, and so forth. But they all have APIs and Globus interfaces. And let me see. I think I've shown that. Yeah. And under the covers, they're all running similar sorts of flows that involve interacting with underlying apparatus and then performing sequences of steps. The cloud is not involved here, except that the actual logic that's managing the sequencing of steps is all cloud hosted. So in that sense, it's taking advantage of the high performance, high reliability, at least, of the cloud systems. And here's I'll show you one more video. So you can probably tell the thing on the left here is a virtual representation of the experiment, and on the right is the actual experiment. But a neat aspect of these agentic sort of implementations of things is it's quite easy to create digital twins of experiments in order to for education, to learn how they operate, and to perhaps detect and respond to errors. Okay, let's go on. All right, so to summarize what I've been saying here, so my interest is, as I said at the beginning, is creating these, reducing the barriers to global science, and of course that's doing that is a huge problem. But I have observed that there's a series of sources of friction that arise that we can reduce in ways that we couldn't have done not that long ago, thanks to our ability to create and deploy these global services that are hosted in the cloud, but that nevertheless are able to act on resources regardless of location and interface by deploying these local agents that interact with the local resource types. And in particular, the cloud hosting allows us to buffer against all sorts of failures that arise in the network, computers, instruments, etc. The ability, fundamental to the ability to make this all work, is this distributed authentication or delegation solution that we've developed that allows you to carefully manage what privileges are provided to who without fear of the wrong person getting to do what you want done. So some lessons that we've learned, the extent to which we can accelerate discovery by providing research platforms like this is, I think, tremendous. Public cloud is a tremendous, public commercial cloud, that is a tremendous resource for building such systems. I still think it isn't used enough for this purpose in the sciences and engineering. The third point here is not the topic of this talk, but it's here that we operate Globus as a not-for-profit service from the University of Chicago, and that's turned out to be an effective way of sustaining something over what is now more than a decade. And I would encourage others to also consider such approaches for such services. Here's some of the team that develops and runs this system. There's about 40 people at the University of Chicago, our funders, and then the researchers behind it include people at Argonne and Chicago, a wonderful group of people who are currently engaged in all sorts of next generation developments of this of these concepts. And one key point is understanding how we can reach yet further down to the edge. So single cloud service, controlling operations at edge devices. It's amazing how robust and powerful and extensible that's been, but ultimately we're probably going to need to reach down to intermediate points between the cloud and the edge systems in order to achieve the alacrity of response that will require in some cases and deal with the ever-increasing data volumes. So thank you very much. Are there people online who can ask questions? I don't know. It's hard to tell.
Any questions?
Yes, yes, of course. Should we not move the data around? Yes, it's a common question, and I feel a bit like Mr. Galileo, was it, who said, he said, but yet it moves, when he was questioned by the Catholic. We're in the Catholic Church said he wasn't supposed to say that the planets moved, but he said, but it does move. So similarly, of course, increasingly we should be trying to compute where the data is or data are. But there are many reasons for people continuing to want to move data. So one is, of course, the data production process seems to be one in which new data sites appear, produce data for a while, and then decline. We often want to combine data from multiple sources. The amount of computing needed for some analysis may be greater than what is useful available locally. But yeah, so one thing that people do with our tools and other tools is increasingly build data portals that will allow for in situ data analysis, and the more we can do that, the better, given the rate at which data volumes are increasing. But they'll still want to be able to move data and run computations and so forth.
The reason I ask is you mentioned about ways so it might be a little bit about to see if the is available, whether it is included.
Yeah, so I don't know so much about, no, I know something about cloud providers, but in the world of science, data is produced in tremendous volumes by everything from astronomical observatories to gene sequencing machines, simulations, and I'd say that people who operate such facilities often lack the resources or expertise to support large in situ analysis capabilities. So a few different modes are being pursued. One is certainly people are trying to build up those capabilities at those sites. Another is that people are moving the data to central facilities where analyses can be performed. For example, the National Institutes of Health have built up some large data collections in Amazon and Google and Microsoft clouds, which to them has the advantage that I think the cloud providers are providing the hosting for free and with the expectation that people will then pay for the compute. So it sort of shifts the cost off the agency, which is a nice thing for the agency's perspective. Whether it's good, the best thing for science long term, it's less clear. Sorry?
Yeah. National Institution of Health or
Yeah. Yep. The National Genomics, National Cancer Institute has a large facility as well. Yeah.
It's really amazing to see that much of data being transferred across multiple countries. And my question is more around data encryption. And I would like to understand like how encryption address or it translate over to with petabytes of data and whether any performance challenges like it can close right now.
Yeah, so I'll say a few things about that. So first of all, talking particularly about our Globus service. So it can, we by default perform integrity checking on every transfer, which is, cryptographic checksum, but is not particularly, that's to protect against accidental or deliberate modification. You can also encrypt data when it's transferred, which so far doesn't seem to be, it hasn't been as big a performance bottleneck as we expected, but I think will become more of one as data rates continue to increase. In that case, what you're doing is encrypting it as you send it and decrypt it when you receive it. So the data is assumed to be stored unencrypted at rest. A more, a different model for things would be that all data is encrypted all the time, and it's only decrypted when you actually want to compute on it. And that's, of course, some people do that in industry. I think some people in the sciences are starting to do that for certain data types, particularly biomedical data. And there's also some interesting computer architecture issues there, how you, protect the whole data path from storage to where you're actually going to compute. But those are not things that I particularly have worked on. Then there's, of course, other wonderful things like, differential privacy and so forth, which I don't know much about.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Over there.
Stuff with Globus. What are you excited about next? Like, what's the next thing you're seeing? Next you do something additional with Globus and that.
Yeah, so what am I excited about next? So I'd say the still high 90% of what people use it for is just moving data, and I'd like to see people using it for more complex flows, and then I'm excited about this notion of embodied agents that are able to perform research on behalf of research, maybe perform parts of research processes that are currently manual in a automated manner. I think that's the key to accelerating discovery in many different areas. And I think we've got some things, of course, there's a lot to be done just to make that happen, but I think the technologies we have are going to be helpful in making, helping people to find data sources, transform data sources into forms in which they can be made sense of, incorporated into models, run models, schedule inference, model training, and all the other things that need to be done. There's a question down here as well.
Well, just going off what you said, like which pieces do you think are most important to keep the humans in the loop, and which pieces do you think are most valuable to keep?
Yeah, that's a great. Which things are most important to keep humans in the loop for? I'm a strong believer myself in what Licklider 60 years ago or so called human-computer symbiosis. I think computers are very good at automating mundane things. I am like probably most of us continually amazed with what people are able to do with large language models, but I think we've still got a very long way to go before they are able to capture the sparks of intuition that drive humans. So I think we need to be thinking, how do we build systems that allow humans to observe what's going on and, you know, spot and respond when something unusual happens. But you know, we shouldn't be, hopefully, you know, 10 or 10 years time, say, we won't have these hordes of graduate students and postdocs just working in the labs doing repetitive activities again and again, but they'll be able to be more creative in what they do.
These days, one of the most important things is regulations by the different countries globally. So, what were the challenges that you had to face in order to design such a system while being on time with different regulations standards across the world?
Yeah, so that's a regulations are a fascinating problem, and actually, we have spent more time on those issues than I would have liked to have spent. It's not been me personally, but we've got some good people who do that. I mean, I'll mention a couple of things that we've had to do, and you know, so far they're fairly mundane, I'd say, but they might get more complicated. And so we want to be able to, well, first of all, in Europe, GPDR, in order to be compliant with those regulations, it means we had to make various changes, primarily around no longer keeping log data that we were previously keeping, that we used to use to analyze various aspects of the performance of the system. So, you know, it's not a big change, but it required careful work and external review. On the, perhaps more interestingly, to be HIPAA compliant and, you know, compliant with the rules governing distribution and sharing of biomedical data, we had to make various changes in terms of logging everything that could be done in order for audit, encrypting data in some cases where it wasn't previously encrypted, taking out a lot of the work we had to do was around how we managed what goes on in the cloud part of the service. You remember, we manage stuff. The actual transfers go from, you know, one client site to another client site. So in that sense, we don't actually have any visibility of the data. So that reduces our requirements in a sense, but we needed to be able to help people who were using the service to see what was being moved in and out so they could ensure that they were compliant with regulations. Now, in the future, it would become more interesting if we started working with data enclaves and managing what goes on inside data enclaves where data is not allowed to leave. And that's not something that we've done too much on, but we are certainly thinking about. We don't do anything with national security data, which would be a whole different sort of regulations. One particular, everything we do is we use the Amazon general public cloud. There are other sub versions of the Amazon cloud like GovCloud, which you know, are suitable for certain sorts of actions that I think particularly those involving, say, the Department of Defense. But that they have only a subset of all Amazon services, so adapting Globus to that purpose would be somewhat expensive.
Last question, and thank you, Dr. Foster, for an amazing talk.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.